Hello my friends, welcome back to this implementation. In the previous tutorial we have implemented exactly that step of the pipeline where Lambda reads the data in S3, and now with the next code section we're about to implement, we will be starting to prepare that step of the pipeline where Lambda trains the machine learning model. Of course we won't start implementing the training now, but we will work on the data preprocessing that we have to do in order to prepare the training, okay? But that step is done, so congratulations, we're making great progress with our pipeline. Alright, so let's do this. Indeed, now we're about to define a function that splits the dataset into the training set and the test set. So here, of course, we would love to use the train test split function by scikit-learn, but which unfortunately only accepts as input lists, NumPy arrays, SciPy matrices, or pandas data frames. And once again, since we were unable to add that layer containing pandas into our Python 3.8 environment, well, that's how we end up here, building our own train test split function. And so we're gonna re-implement that from scratch, and that's okay, because that's excellent coding practice. And you will see, it will be much easier than what we did previously here. Alright, so let's do this. Let's start with def, because we're gonna define a new function, which this time we will call split underscore data, and which will take as input, well, first our data, exactly that data that will be returned by the read CSV from S3 function, in the way we pre-processed it here, of course, and then as a second argument it will take, of course, the test, let's call it ratio, which is of course the percentage of observations, of data points that will go into the test set. And by default we will set a value of 0.10, 10%, because actually, our dataset is not that big, and besides, the purpose of the pipeline here is to automatically retrain the ML model as the data comes in. Alright, so there you go. That's the arguments here, then colon, and now let's implement what this function has to do. Alright, so first we're going to do something that we have not done much before, in the other courses, because it's actually part of the train test split function which we're used to, but actually it's done in the backend and we can't see it explicitly. But the first thing we have to do here is to shuffle the data. That's extremely important to do it before you do the split, because it will ensure that the split into the training set and the test set is not biased by any inherent order in the data. Alright, so that shuffling is always done, and to do it here, well, we're going to use a simple function by the NumPy library, more specifically by the random module of the NumPy library, which is the shuffle function. Okay, so there we go. First we call our NumPy library, which has a shortcut here, as you can see, np. So np, from which we call first that random module, and from which we call that shuffle function. Okay, and which takes, of course, as input the data. The data that is the argument here in our split data function. Alright, the next step is to get the index of the split after the shuffling, of course, which will be that index separating the training set and the test set. So basically, all the data points that have their indexes below that index will go into the training set, and all the data points that have their indexes after that index will go into the test set. Alright? And since we just shuffled the data, well, in order to get that index, which we're going to call split index, well, we're simply going to get it this way by taking the length of our dataset, meaning the number of observations in our dataset, then multiplied by 1 minus the test ratio. And because the split index is of course an integer, well, we're going to make sure that all this is an integer by taking the closest integer of that calculation. And how do we do this? Well, that's thanks to the int function, which takes all of this as input. Okay, so for example, if we have indeed a test ratio of 0.10, meaning 10%, then that means that this will be equal to 90%, and therefore the split index will be the index at the 90% of the total number of observations. So for example, if we have 1000 observations, then that index will be 900. And so in that same example, that means that the 900 first observations will go into the training set, and the 100 last observations will go into the test set. Alright, and finally, last step here. I told you this was going to be easier than before. Well, finally, we have to, of course, return the training set and the test set, which we're going to get thanks to our split index. And so, how do we use that? Well, first we take our data, of course. Then we add a pair of square brackets. And now, first we are returning the training set. So how are we going to take the training set? Remember, all the first observations until the split index go into the training set. So here we're going to take all the rows until the split index. Here it is. So that's for the training set. And now, of course, for the test set, we take our data again, we add a pair of square brackets, and this time we're going to take all the rows, meaning all the data points from the split index until the last one. And so we take the range from the split index, here it is, up to the last one. All right, so that was actually super simple, you know, but the most important thing here is to remember that you always have to shuffle the data before you make the split. Okay, and I remind that this is in order to prevent any order-based biases in the training set and test set. All right, so there you go. Congratulations for implementing that new code section here. We're getting close to that new step of the pipeline. We still have one more code section to do for data preprocessing, which is this one, in which we will define a function that extracts the features and target from the training set or test set. In other words, we'll make separately that matrix of features and that dependent variable vector for both the training set and the test set.
Now make sure to check out these videos on the right or the full course in the description to continue your learning, and I look forward to seeing you there.